My name is Jon Tunheim. I'm the county prosecutor. This presentation may surprise you coming from the county prosecutor, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I became so intensely interested in hope theory, and I think that'll make a connection, but I will tell you now that I've become convinced that hope theory kind of permeates through everything we do. So it's not only relevant to criminal justice, it's relevant to basically everything we do. And I hope that by the end of this, you'll see that as well. What I'd like to do today is to go through my presentation, which has a slideshow that goes with it. That's as much for me as it is for you to kind of keep me organized in my comments. So I'll go through that, and then hopefully at the end, if I can get through it quickly enough, we'll have some time and we could do some question and answer, or I'd love to hear feedback as well. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about how I became interested in hope theory. So not a little bit after I was elected prosecuting attorney, I became very interested in some research that had to do with trauma and how trauma impacts people. The research is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Research, and it really looked at this connection between trauma, childhood trauma, and then all kinds of adverse later in life outcomes, one of which is higher criminal justice involvement and those kinds of things, which is why I became so interested in that idea, particularly since we know that a lot of people coming into the criminal justice system are people that have experienced some significant trauma in their lives, usually as children. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a conference, a domestic violence conference, and there was a breakout session there that had the words trauma and hope in the title. And I don't remember exactly what the title was, but I'll tell you, at the time I was more focused on the trauma than I was the hope. The hope sounded kind of like a nice fluff word for that presentation, but I was really interested in the idea of trauma. And I walked in, I sat down, and the researcher who was presenting that breakout, his name is Dr. Chen Hellman. He's with the University of Oklahoma in Tulsa. He's now become a very good friend of mine. He's probably one of the leading hope researchers in the world right now. Started talking about hope. And for a minute I thought, I'm not sure this is what I really signed up for. I really wanted to hear more about trauma. But I will tell you what, as I sat there and I listened to him talk about hope and hope theory, the science of hope, if you will, it really profoundly changed the way that I see the world. And I mean that very sincerely. It changed the way that I see the world in a very profound way. So ever since then, I've been learning as much as I can learn about hope theory. I've been talking about it. I've been doing this presentation. I've done this presentation all over the community in a variety of different contexts. And I'm so pleased that I was invited to come do it for all of you and also for the TCTV audience. So that's my connection to this. And I hope my goal right now, my personal goal, and that word goal will be important in a moment, my personal goal is to make Thurston County a hope-informed community, okay? In 1600, give or take, Martin Luther penned this quote: "Everything that is done in the world is done by hope." And the interesting thing about what I found out about hope research is that this is really an evidence-based statement now. In fact, everything that is done in the world is done by hope. And by the end of this presentation, you'll see the relevance of that. I want to tell you just a little bit about the background of hope theory and the science of hope theory. Hope theory comes out of a body of psychology called positive psychology. Positive psychology was really a field that developed when psychologists thought, you know, instead of always studying what's wrong with people, maybe we should be studying what's right with people. Maybe we should look at character strengths in people and find out how those help people succeed in life. What is it about those strengths that helps people thrive and flourish and so forth? And so they developed a list of about 25 different character strengths. They're used in a wide variety of situations. Has anybody ever done a character strengths assessment? Because they're used in a lot of different contexts. Strengths Finder, things like that. A few people are nodding their heads. That's all comes out of positive psychology, right? So there's this list of all of these different positive attributes for people that they began to research and study, and among those was hope, okay? And what they started to find was, as they started looking at hope as it relates to all of these other things, is that hope kept rising to the top as one of the leading predictors of whatever it is they were studying. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, right? But hope really kept rising to the top as one of the most significant predictors of what it was they were looking at, to the point now where the hope researchers really feel like hope may be the single best predictor of a person's ability to thrive and flourish. Now that's a pretty big statement, right? The single best predictor of a person's ability to thrive and flourish. So that's how important they feel like this research is at the time. When we measure hope, and yes, hope can be measured, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but when they measure hope, to do that, they've got to give it a very specific definition. So we talk about hope in a variety of different contexts. If you started paying attention to whenever somebody used the word hope, you would hear it a lot in a variety of different ways. From, gosh, I hope the rain goes away and the sun comes out tomorrow, to, you know, talking about hopes and dreams, or I hope I can accomplish this thing that I'm working on, you know, I hope I make my deadline, whatever that is, right? But whatever it is, we use that word hope consistently in a way that talks about the future, okay? So when I talk about hope, what I'm always talking about is the future, something about the future. And here's how I'm going to define it for purposes of hope theory, okay? This is the definition of hope. Hope is the belief that the future can be better than the present, and that we have the ability to make it so, okay? So that's two pieces, and they're both important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about why they're so critical to each other. But the first one is the belief that the future can be better than the present. That's that consistent belief that there's always something about the future that can be better. The researchers call that optimism, okay? That's optimism. But there's a difference between optimism and hope, because hope also contemplates the second thing, and that is that we actually have the ability to influence our future. We have the ability to create a future for ourselves, and we have influence over how that develops. And both are critically important for this idea of hope, and both are involved in the measurement of hope, okay? All right. By definition then, if we're always thinking about a better future, that the future can be better, what we're talking about is a theory of change. So hope is really a theory of change. It's about looking at ways to change the future to make it better, to improve it, okay? All right. When we measure hope, the first hope scale was created by a researcher from the University of Kansas named Dr. Rick Snyder. He developed two hope scales. One is for children and one is for adults. These numbers won't mean anything to you, but I will share with you at some point the hope scale, where you could actually assess your own hope if you want to and take a look at where you are in the hope scale. But they classify, as they've been using this tool, and by the way, this tool now has been validated many, many times over. It's readily accepted in the scientific community. Some of the questions you might actually see in other contexts, like employment survey kinds of questions, things like that, because a lot of the questions have to do with goal setting and goal achievement and so forth. It's actually a very simple tool. The tool itself is only 12 questions, all right? But it has been validated many, many times over as an accurate measure, and they have literally measured the hope of people, millions of people around the world, children and adults, in the research that they've done. Why would we want to measure hope? Okay, well, one of the reasons is we would want to measure it is because hope is universal. Okay, so hope is really fundamental to the human condition. It permeates across cultures and gender and all different kinds of all the differences you would find in the human population. Everywhere they've looked, they found that every subset of people, if you will, has the capacity to have hope, okay? It's also not related to things like intelligence, so they've looked at comparisons between hope and IQ and found no correlation whatsoever. So you can have a person that has average or lower IQ that could be a very high hope person, and vice versa. It's also not associated with social status or wealth or income or any of those things. So you can have a person who's living in poverty that still has the capacity to have a very high hope. And vice versa, you can also have a person who's living a very wealthy lifestyle who could be low hope. So the nice thing about that is we don't have to worry about adjusting for any of those variables. You can just look at hope across any population that you're looking at, and it always has the same capacity. The other thing that I like about hope theory is that it suggests that hope skills can in fact be taught and learned. So unlike trauma, if you experience trauma in your life, that trauma is always there. And you might be able to develop skills to make you more resilient to that trauma and so forth. Hope, we can actually measure the change, and we can actually teach and learn hope. And the research suggests, and this is what I think is one of the coolest things about hope, is that it's actually contagious. So hope actually spreads naturally. The researcher I work with, he likes to say that hope is a social gift we give each other, which I think is a very cool statement, right? So just by having a high hope person, the research has suggested we take a high hope person and we put them and have them working in a group of lower hope people, and then they measure after they've worked together for a while, the hope score of the low hope people comes up, not the other way around. It doesn't take the high hope person down. And then they go out another layer, and the same thing happens. So it literally does spread. It's literally contagious, okay? All right. Why would we care about looking at hope? What are the outcomes that are associated with hope? This is what caught my attention when I was in that initial breakout session. This is what started me understanding how important this was in all aspects of life, starting with education, okay? In education, hope now is associated with a letter grade of better performance in school. So a high hope kid on average will score a letter grade higher than a lower hope kid. It reduces absenteeism, and right now hope is actually the best predictor of a person's success in college and the best predictor of their success in law school. And it outperforms as a predictor the ACT, the SAT, or high school GPA. Yet no institution that I know of does a hope assessment as part of its admission process, but it is the best predictor of success in college. It also performs a lot of positive predictions in high school performance, like I talked about, letter grade, absenteeism, and so forth. In the workplace, which is maybe something that we're interested in this setting, hope accounts for significantly lower absenteeism. So high hope people tend to be absent from work less, to the point of almost 4 times less. Okay, it reduces that by almost 4 times. It affects productivity in a very positive way. So a high hope person tends to produce as much work in 4 days that a low hope person might do in 5 days. On average, it increases productivity by about a day a week. High hope people are more open to organizational change. They tend to achieve their goals more often and sooner, and are constantly working on their goals. And high hope people are much more resilient, and this has been actually replicated in a number of studies. High hope people are more resilient to stress, so workplace stress, vicarious trauma, which is this idea that when you are dealing with people who are in crisis or having trauma, that vicariously you end up having to absorb some of that stress and trauma yourself, vicarious trauma, or what we call compassion fatigue, and that is that we recognize that when you are accessing your ability to be compassionate with people, that actually takes energy from you and it fatigues you. High hope people tend to be much more resilient to compassion fatigue. I've found this to be the case in my own shop, where we've been, we have people who are working domestic violence cases, working with victims constantly, working with abused children, other people in crisis. And so that's one of the reasons I've become really interested in how this applies in that setting. Here's something, they've done some research across the business community and found that high hope managers have higher profit businesses. Okay. What else? In the health, just in personal health. So high hope people tend to engage in much healthier behavior. So They tend to avoid smoking, tend to, overindulgence in alcohol or drugs or any of those kinds of things. They take care of themselves. They exercise regularly, those kinds of things, because they see health as a pathway to other goals that they want to meet, or they see health as a goal in and of itself. But either way, it is a part of hope. That'll make more sense in a minute when I actually start talking about hope in more detail. High hope people have higher pain tolerance. There are lower rates of depression. So there's been specific research that has predicted depression by hope, by low hope. It increases resilience to post-traumatic stress. And the bottom line is high hope people live longer, which is interesting because in the trauma study, what they found is that people who have experienced significant trauma as a child live shorter. There's a higher mortality rate. So if we can actually build hope in those that have experienced significant trauma, we could perhaps even extend their life. And perhaps this is the biggest one here. So in looking at correlations between hope and happiness, when most people are asked what it is that they really want in life, they may give a variety of answers, but when you drill into it, at the end of the day, what most people want in life is just to be happy. They just want to feel happy, okay? And so when they started looking at the research on happiness, people were much more likely to report themselves as feeling happy if they were higher hope people. So hope is directly associated with happiness. Okay, so we've got this definition of hope, which is the future is better than the present, the belief that the future can be better than the present, and that we have the ability to make it so. So let's break down hope into its basic elements. This is where we get into the real specifics of hope theory. Now, one of the things I love about hope theory is that it's very, very simple. So this is not a complex thing to grasp at all. It's basically got three core elements. The first is a goal. Okay, so if we're thinking about some way that the future is better than the present, the way we articulate that or think about that is in a goal. We set a goal for ourselves, okay? I want this thing to be better in the future. That becomes my goal, okay? So the goal becomes this idea that there's something about the future that can be better. And this is what that looks like, okay? But again, hope contemplates more than just the belief that the future can be better. It's also that we have the ability to influence that. We have the ability to make it so. And if that's the case, then hope theory also says that we not only need to set a goal for ourselves, but we need to be able to think about and create a pathway to that goal, which is really just saying it's a strategy to achieve that goal, whatever that looks like, okay? If any of you have ever been involved in a strategic planning process, like if you sit on a board or maybe you've worked in your county workplace and you've been working on a strategic plan for your organization, I don't know. But strategic planning is really about building hope in an organization. It's applied hope theory is what it is, because you're talking about goals for the organization, you're talking about strategies, which is just another word for pathways on how you're going to achieve that goal, okay? So goals and pathways. And the third thing is what the researchers call agency. My word for it is willpower, because I think that's a little bit more common word. And think about that for a minute. So if I've got a goal, if I see something out there that, yeah, this would be a better future for me, and I could see that as a goal, and I can see a pathway to that goal, I know how I could achieve it, but you know what? I'm not really motivated to achieve that goal. How much energy am I going to apply towards achieving that goal? Not much. That's the willpower. So hope theory contemplates that not only do you set goals and see pathways there, but you motivate yourself. You have the willpower to apply energy to achieve that goal, to move forward, okay? So now when I say the word hope, the three things that should just automatically come to mind is goals, pathways, and agency. Those are the core elements of hope. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
When you're talking goals, are you thinking grand goals, like I want to write a book one day, or goals like I should read 100 minutes?
Yeah. So I'm going to repeat the question so we get it into the microphone. The question was about, does it have to be a big goal, small goal? What about the goal? Goals, hope theory suggests the goal needs to be two things, okay? One is desirable. It needs to be a desirable goal. In other words, it's a goal that you want to achieve. It's something that is desirable to you, okay? And the second thing is that the goal needs to be achievable, or at least perceived by the person setting the goal as being achievable, okay? Desirable and achievable. Now, those of you who've worked in strategic planning have probably heard this idea of the SMART goal. We've used that in a number of different settings. It's an acronym: specific, measurable, actionable, blah, 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 whatever. I can't even always remember what it stands for. SMART goals is really about the achievability piece in hope theory. Okay, it's about seeing the pathway there, knowing how to measure when you've achieved that goal, or knowing how you're doing in terms of achieving that goal. Can you measure it and so forth? That's just achievability. Now, to come back to your original question, doesn't matter. Big goal, small goal, doesn't really matter, because hope theory really just contemplates that you're looking at the future. Okay, you're future focused, and it could be a small goal, could be a big goal. Now, there is a relationship between kind of the size of the goal, or maybe the importance of the goal, if you will, and the agency, the willpower. So if it's the goals, for instance, that the hope theorists will tell you are the most important goals that we have for ourselves, are the goals in which we find meaning and purpose, okay? If we have a goal that gives us meaning and purpose in our life, those will be the most motivating goals, and then you'll have the highest agency. So kind of the importance of the goal is directly related to how much willpower or agency you're going to be willing to apply to that goal. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. All right, so here's a diagram. If I was going to diagram hope theory, again, remember, this is very simple, and it's intended to be very simple. This is essentially what it would look like, right? You've got agency, which is willpower towards a goal. You've got a pathway or strategies to achieve that goal. Those two are both essential elements, so they have to both be there. If I have a willpower towards a goal, if I'm high agency towards a goal, but I've got no pathway there. So for instance, remember when I went back and said, I hope the sun comes out tomorrow? I have no pathway to that goal, right? I might see that as a better future. I might see that as a goal, if you will, but I've got no pathway there because I've got no control over it. Research, the positive psychologists will tell you that you don't have hope. What you have there is a wish, okay? You're wishing the sun will come out tomorrow, but hope contemplates that you have both the desire, the willpower to get to this goal, and the strategy or the pathway to get to it. All right. So we've talked a little bit about hope. Those are the basic elements of hope. Let's talk about hopelessness for a minute. So when I say the word hopelessness, what words come to mind? Just what do you think about when if I were to say somebody's hopeless, how would you describe that? Sad. Giving up. Despair. Yeah. Yeah, those are all, I do this in most of my presentations, and those are the themes that clearly come out. And they're all actually parts or progressions along the way to hopelessness. As they started studying hope, they also were studying hopelessness, kind of by definition. And what they noticed was there is a very specific progression, if you will, of somebody that goes from hope to hopelessness. So I'm going to go through that really quickly. If we assume that somebody who is a hopeful person or has high hope, then what we're assuming there, based on the definition that we've given, is that they have goal or goals, they see a better future, they see pathways on how to achieve that goal, they're motivated and so forth. That's the definition of a hope person. So what starts somebody down the pathway, if you will, to hopelessness is the goal gets blocked by something, okay? They have a goal, there's something out there, they see a strategy or pathway, and it becomes blocked, okay? Here's a very simple example or illustration of what that might look like. You've got a meeting in Seattle at a very specific time. It's a fairly important meeting. You really need to be there. You get on the freeway, you're going north, and there's a crash, and traffic stops. And now we all know that there's pretty much only one route from here, one pathway, if you will, from here to Seattle, right? And that's I-5. If there's a crash, you're in trouble, right? And so what's your reaction to that? Ugh. Frustration, right? Stress, frustration. That's kind of that basic feeling of the progression of hopelessness. You've got a goal, in other words, to be there for this meeting. The pathway is there in terms of your drive going up, but it becomes blocked. And that's kind of the basic essence of this. Now, the bigger the goal, the more important the goal to the person, the more profound that reaction might be. So you could actually have not just frustration, you might have anger, or you might even have just out and out rage. You might have somebody that just goes into a rage, okay, because they perceive that that this goal is blocked. Now, a high hope person, if they have a blocked goal, will often do one of two things. One is they'll find a different pathway, okay? So in the traffic example, when the freeway stops, one of the first things you start doing is, I wonder if I could get off here, and I go over here, and I go up, 167 or something like that, right? Again, that's kind of an illustration of the way that a hopeful person would try to deal with that. They're going to try to find another pathway to the goal, okay? Or they might just re-goal. If they're willing to give up the goal, they might just say, nah, well, okay, I'll just set a different goal, right? And they'll re-goal, all right? But if this goal is important enough that they're not willing to re-goal and they can't find another pathway, then what happens is the frustration and the anger, if you will, turns to sadness and to despair. So now this goal is profoundly blocked from what they can perceive. And they really get to this sense of futility. There's nothing I can do. I've tried everything. I don't see a pathway there. But that's not complete hopelessness. The hope theorists will say that there's still hope there because the person still sees that desirable goal. They still see a future that's better than the present. They're still focused on the future. But the problem is that they can't get there. So there's still a little bit of hope. If there was a pathway that opened up, some opportunity that came up, they could almost automatically go back to a hopeful state. And so they could become hopeful again. But if that blockage is persistent, then they will go into despair. There is very well documented evidence that despair from hopelessness actually moves to depression. So people who actually experience depression, oftentimes, when you really are listening to them, and this comes out of the research materials from Dr. Snyder, actually, that what you will actually hear is that there's something about the future that they see that's blocked for them, that there's a profoundly blocked goal. But true hopelessness, as it's defined in hope theory, is actually apathy. That's that giving up that you talked about, right? This is the idea now that we're just going to abandon the goal, right? We're not going to set a new goal. We don't care about the future anymore. It's like the young boy on the screen there that has his hand up and says, I don't care, right? The person just basically doesn't care about the future anymore. They don't look for goals. They don't set goals. They become very much just in the present or maybe focused on the past, but they're not looking to the future anymore. And they just become apathetic to the future, okay? So that's hopelessness. So how do we get somebody out of that state of hopelessness, okay? Well, we gotta go back to the core elements of hope theory, the first of which is setting a goal. Okay, so the idea is the person's got to get, again, reoriented to the future. So they've got to be willing to abandon the goal or find a different goal or set a new goal, something. They've got to re-goal, okay? Now, again, to go back to this idea of does it have to be a big goal, small goal, doesn't really matter. As particularly if you've got a person who's kind of working themselves out of hopelessness, because the most important thing is that they become forward focused again. They start looking at the future instead of being caught up in the present or the past. So it could be a small goal, right? For people coming out of recovery, coming out of addiction, going into recovery, the goal may be to make it through tomorrow without using again. Okay, in fact, I've become really interested in hope theory as it applies to recovery, addiction recovery, and we're talking about it in our drug court as well as other areas of recovery. So that could be a very small goal, but an important goal and a forward-facing goal, okay? Now what happens is when the person sets the goal, if in fact it's a desirable goal and it's one that they believe that they can achieve, then their agency will start to build, okay? They'll start to feel some excitement about achieving that goal, some optimism, if you will, the belief that they can actually achieve that better future. And the next step then is to get them thinking about pathways to that goal. Because again, hope is about both, right? Agency, goals, agencies, and pathways. So that's where the strategic thinking part comes in. Let's think about, here's the goal. What do we need to do to get to that goal? Okay, what do we need to accomplish now, next, what are the steps to that goal? And there might even be the creation of sub-goals. So if it's a bigger goal, there might be little smaller goals along the way, kind of these benchmark goals. Well, I need to achieve this, and I need to achieve this, and I need to achieve this. And each of those can be an articulable goal that the person is setting, and they're progressional so that they lead to achievement of a bigger goal, okay? And it's all a pathway. Creating a future memory. So when we actually talk about goals or think about goals for ourselves, the interesting thing is we don't usually think about them in terms of words. The way we think about goals for ourselves is in our imagination, right? You start creating visions of what it looks like when you achieve that goal. In fact, the research suggests that imagination is really the foundation, if you will, of hope, because you start envisioning and thinking about what does this better future look like. And as it turns out, as you're thinking about this and you're creating a vision in your mind of what it looks like when you achieve that goal, your brain stores that into memory, just as if you had experienced it. You get these pictures in your memory about what it looks like when you achieve that goal. In the research, we call that building future memories or creating future memories. And the reason that's so important is because a person who's got a longer term goal will consistently access that memory to motivate themselves, because they're going to consistently remind themselves what it looks like when they achieve that goal. That's what keeps them motivated, right? And so think about just in your own experience, if you've had a big goal and you're kind of working hard, towards that, and there's a number of different steps that you have to do to complete that. Every once in a while, do you go back and remember what it is that it looks like when you achieve that goal as a way to motivate yourself? That's creating future memories. And from that, what we get is hope. So if we accomplish a sub-goal and that sense of achievement, it builds agency and confidence that, in fact, we can achieve goals. And then what happens is this becomes cyclical. So a high hope person will be constantly working through this progression of setting goals, finding pathways, motivating themselves, creating future memories, going to a next goal, and looping. In fact, a high hope person will often be working multiple goals at the same time. They'll have goals in their personal life. Maybe they've got a hobby that they're working on. They're setting goals in that, or a pastime. They might be setting goals in their relationships. They might be setting goals in the workplace, and they might be working these multiple goals all at the same time. Okay? And it's all kind of going through this same progression. Some of the really interesting research that's just coming out is on how the brain reacts to thinking about the future and this idea of hope. And of course now they can pretty much monitor how your brain reacts to a variety of different circumstances. And so one of the studies that they did actually started to watch brain activity while they were asking the person questions that were designed to provoke them to think about the future. Okay? And the interesting thing is the first thing to light up was that base brain that has in that our imagination, our creativity, and memory and so forth, the amygdala. So the idea is, again, when you start thinking about the future, you do that by accessing your imagination. And also by thinking about the past, because if the future is going to be better than the present or the past, you're kind of automatically comparing what that looks like to what this looks like. Okay? Then, and so that's the idea of this. That's how your brain starts to create a goal, is it starts to imagine what would a better future look like? What is that, what's the picture that I have in my mind of that? And the next step is it goes through the part of the brain which controls emotion. So the idea there is, or the thought there is that your brain also wants to decide how emotionally invested you are in this goal, which is basically just saying how desirable is this goal? How much do you desire it? Okay? And so your brain's kind of looking at that and thinking, this is something that would be really positive, I'm really emotionally invested in, and it uses those emotions to drive up agency. Some people, when you ask them the question, what is hope? Or if I were to ask you even before this talk, if you thought hope was an emotion, was an emotional process, I think a lot of you would have responded positively. The hope is an emotional process, a reaction. And it is, I think, in part. Although the hope research will argue very strongly that hope is a cognitive process, it's a thinking process. But intertwined in there is this idea that there is emotional investment in the goal, that you use your emotional investment to motivate you towards that goal, okay? And then what happens is the next place to light up in the brain is the prefrontal cortex. So that's the executive decision-making part of the brain. That's the part of the brain where you start to think about pathways, strategies. I know what the goal is. I'm emotionally invested in it. I've got agency towards that goal, okay? So now how do I get there? What's my pathway there? And literally they watch the brain light up in that progression so that by the end of the experiment, if you will, the entire brain is lit up and working on that. So in a way, hope becomes exercise for the brain. And it's actually just the opposite of trauma, because trauma actually tends to shut the brain down because you become very focused and you get all these hormones that are pumping in, this fight or flight and all of that comes from stress. And it actually reduces brain development, brain activity. Hope actually is brain exercise. All right. So I've started thinking about what does hope mean for organizations and how do we look at being hopeful leaders? Now, when I'm in the context where I'm talking about hope-inspired leadership, I'm not talking about authority. I'm not talking about position or title. What I'm talking about is being a leader in your organization with regard to developing a hopeful culture and a hopeful organization. And we know that in any organization there exists both formal and informal leaders, right? So I'm really looking at more of this idea of informal leadership, of being a leader in your organization in terms of inspiring hope, okay? And the first thing is, I think, and this is just my own kind of thoughts and reflections about this. It's really a work in progress, if you will. But my first thought is, and that is to start with yourself, right? To look at hope as a personal philosophy, which is why I picked this illustration, because it's the rock in the middle of the ripples. And we know that hope is contagious, right? So it starts with us. So how do we work and build our own hope? Well, we know that hope can be taught and can be learned, right? And it can be thought about. It's a cognitive process. So the bottom line is, to be a hopeful person, you've got to be consciously thinking about the future. You've got to be looking for a better future, a positive future, whatever that looks like. Whether it's for you personally or the group of people around you or in your organization, whatever that is. But you've got to be future focused. That's step one in being adopting hope as a personal philosophy. The second thing is to actually be mindful about goals, right? To really think about it in those contexts. If I see this better future, how do I create a goal around that? And what other goals might exist along the way? So what are the sub-goals that I would need to achieve to accomplish this bigger goal? What is the pathway of goals, if you will, to get there? And to be mindful of that. Now remember, the goals that motivate us the most are those in which we find meaning and purpose. And I actually really think that we who work in public service, work for county government, need to really step back from time to time and think about this. Think about what is it that we're doing for this community? Why did we get into this work in the first place? Do we find meaning and purpose in the work that we're doing? Because job satisfaction, I know our HR people will agree with this. In just about every survey I've ever seen, money, salary, all of that, not the highest thing in job satisfaction. Generally, when you drill into it, what you're going to try to find is whether the person is finding meaning and purpose. They might use other words, but the idea is, are they really finding purpose in what they're doing? okay? So be thinking about that in terms of your goals. What is it that motivates you? What do you find meaning and purpose in? Maybe you've got a fairly mundane task, but is there a way to create that task or to set a goal around that task which attaches it to a bigger meaning or a bigger purpose that you're working on, okay? So be mindful of that. Think strategically. This is about being an innovator, right? The old expression, think outside the box. We use it all the time. Well, that's just basically a hopeful expression, right? Because if you've got a goal that's blocked, you got to be creative. You got to be a problem solver. You got to be thinking about, how do I get around this blockage, or how is there another pathway to this goal? And a high hope person will actually even be anticipating those blockages before they get there. Well, I've got this pathway there, but this thing could pop up and this could get in my way. So what am I going to do there? Maybe I'll pick a different pathway around that goal or whatever, okay? Or maybe I'm just going to decide to re-goal at some point. And where's that point at? But the idea is to be proactive in thinking about that. And finally, seeing the world through a hopeful lens. And what I mean by this is, now that I've become familiar with hope theory, basically everything I see I'm analyzing in hope theory. Now I've been, as prosecutor, and before when I was a deputy prosecutor, I have heard probably hundreds of stories of recovery, for instance, in the drug courts and in other settings. In the last few years I've been studying hope theory. In every one of those recovery stories, I can pick out a point to you that indicates where that person regained hope, because they start thinking about the future, okay? And frankly, if you go to a drug court graduation, which if you haven't been one, you got to go to one sometime, right? If you go to a drug court graduation, I guarantee you just about everybody telling their story will use that word hope in some form or another in their recovery story. There is a lot of hope in this world. And what we do is, if we find that hope, we see the world through that hopeful lens, it makes us hopeful ourselves, right? Think about people who have gone through significant tragedies in their lives. They've lost somebody to a disease, and then they start working to raise money for, cancer research or something like that. Or they lose somebody in a crash, and now they've become a leader in Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Whatever that is. Think about folks that you've seen do that. That's all about hope. That's about somebody saying, I've experienced this tragedy in my life, but there's something I can do to make a better future out of that. That's a hopeful act, right? We can be inspired by that to be hopeful ourselves. I love watching America's Got Talent, right? The finals are on. Does anybody else watch that show? So I got into these shows. My son, is a performer, a stage performer, got us into this when he was in high school, when we started with American Idol and all that. And interesting thing about that is that American Idol was the first talent show to go to a different format, because they not only started featuring the talent on the show, but they started giving you the story. And that actually comes out of the Olympics. I never knew this. Somebody was talking to me about this a while ago, that when they cover the Olympics, a way of getting beyond just you watching the athletes perform is they start telling you about their story, the story of the athletes, and it raises the entertainment value. Well, they started doing that at American Idol as a way to try to create a different format for talent shows, and boom, right? Huge success. Now that recurs in every talent show that you see, you're always going to see the backstory of the person who's performing, okay? Well, these are all stories of hope. I mean, on America's Got Talent, if you're watching this, you've got a young woman whose father is literally dying of cancer while she's doing these performances. He's terminal. He is not going to survive this, but she's on stage and she's performing for millions of people. It's incredible. There's a woman on there who is the sole survivor of a plane crash. She was in a sports team. All of the members of her sports team died in this plane crash. She's the lone survivor, and now she's on this stage again performing. She was seriously injured, seriously disfigured, and she's up there just singing her heart out. Another woman who's deaf, who's a singer. She was a singer, and then during the course of this, lost her hearing, and she continues to perform even though she can't hear anything. That's incredible, and these are all stories of hope. So the difference between just watching that and saying, that's entertaining, And looking at it through hope lenses, we can become inspired by that, right? And we can stay hopeful ourselves. So then how do we inspire hope in others? Well, the first thing is you gotta have a relationship. Am I gonna be willing to talk to you about my goals if I don't trust you, if I don't have a relationship with you? Hope is a social gift we give each other. And in order to do that, you've got to have a relationship. So hope-inspired leadership is built in relationships and having relationships with the people that are around you. It's essential. Then it's kind of about using this hope lens, listening to people when they talk and listening to hear what are their goals, what is it that they see in the future that's better. Helping them understand and think about, well, how do I create that future? What are the goals that I should set? What are the pathways to that? Help them create a future memory by asking, well, what does that look like when you achieve that? How do you see the future? Describe that to me. Because what they'll do is they'll build that future memory while they're describing it. The important thing is don't create an expectation and don't do anything that imposes your goals on them, right? Because the goal needs to be desirable and achievable to them. It needs to be their goal, not your goal. How motivated are they going to be to maybe achieve your goal? Now, if any of you have had kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because when you tried to set goals for your kids, if your kid didn't share that goal, they weren't very motivated to achieve it, okay? So that's the idea, is you gotta help people create their own goals, not impose your goals. Find pathways, anticipate barriers together. So that means hope building is about collaboration. If you've ever heard of there's a technique that came out of substance abuse treatment called motivational interviewing. It's kind of the big thing now in substance abuse treatment. And motivational interviewing, again, is just applied hope theory. It's about interviewing somebody in a way that allows them to talk about their own future and articulate the pathway to get there. Recognize people when they achieve those goals. That idea of recognition, because it's that affirmation that I achieved the goal, right? And it builds agency to the next goal. Build a hopeful culture, which means talk about hope openly, talk about goals, talk about pathways, do it openly and create a culture around that. In our office right now, I'm going to be doing a goal-setting interview with every employee in my office over the next year with exactly this kind of conversation. What do you see in the future? What are your goals? How are you going to achieve them? What can I do to support that? That kind of thing, because we want to try to create this culture. So it brings me back to my theme, right, when I started. Everything that's done in the world is done by hope, because everything that we achieve starts with a goal, right? Everything that we've achieved starts with a goal. We figured out a pathway to get there, we were motivated, and we accomplished it. Thank you very much for listening. That's my hope talk, and if we've got a minute or two, I'm happy to engage in questions, and I will talk about this anytime, so if you want to just catch me on the side and talk about it, I'd be happy to do that. And by the way, if you've got another organization or another group that you're involved in, a community group, whatever it is, and you want me to come out and do this talk for them, just let me know. I'm happy to do it. I will go anywhere, anytime to talk about hope. Thank you.